with some typical sort of standard pictures of what we might call an animal and a plant cell. So we'll start with the animal cell. Now the problem with, of course, cells is that there are many different types, and so they don't all look like this. This picture we're going to draw is sort of like the sort of standard version of what a cell may kind of look like. But then you have to consider that there are all kinds of modifications to this picture to get cells to do their special jobs. Like a bone cell looks different than a muscle cell, which looks different than a nerve cell. So first, we're just going to take this, we call it sort of a typical cell, which means it's kind of like just an example, but it doesn't mean that they all look exactly like this. There's variations of all kinds, and we'll learn the variations as we go. So let's begin. You need about a half a page at least. I'm just going to move this up. Animal cell, typical animal cell, and we're going to draw this as best we can. It's hard on this board to draw because my board is longer or is wider than it is long. So what I'm going to do is take a black, and I'm just going to go around like this and make a wiggly line with no particular pattern whatsoever. This line will represent the cell membrane, the outer membrane of the cell. Now remember what it looks like. It's not a black line. It's actually a layer of phospholipid molecules, right? In our last video, we saw all that. The last lesson was what the membrane looks like and what it does. But now we're just drawing it as a line, as kind of a shortcut. Okay, we're going to start in the middle. I'll choose different colors until I run out of colors, but here we'll draw in the middle a sort of a round structure like this. And so this little red line is also a membrane. It's another membrane that closes off this particular part of the cell. This is in the middle, and so a word that describes this center is the nucleus, right? The nuclear sort of means center, or the middle. Just like the middle of an atom is called the nucleus, well, the middle of the cell is called the nucleus, and this nucleus has a very important role to play in the cell. I'll talk about what each part does as we draw, but afterwards we'll write out sentences for each of the structures so we know what they do. The nucleus basically contains all of the genes, the genetic material, the DNA, that basically has the instructions for how the cell is built and how it runs. So we often call it the control center. Okay? It's not a good idea to call it the brain of the cell, because a brain means a very special thing in biology. It means a complicated structure made of many cells in your head. So it's not really a brain at all. It's got nothing to do with a brain. But it does sort of perform a similar function. It controls the cell, and it contains the instructions for how to build it. So there's the nucleus of the cell. We'll label that in a minute. Now I'll take this blue, and maybe I'll take a thinner line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a windy sort of structure that goes around like this, wiggles back and forth like that. And maybe I'll do another sort of piece over here. And maybe even over here there might be some like that. The problem with drawing on a flat board is, of course, a cell is round. It's like a sphere or spherical, right? It's got 3D shape to it. And when you look at cells under a microscope, the microscope focuses only on sort of one layer at a time. So this blue structure that I've drawn is actually everywhere, all through the cell. But we're pretending that we only see bits and pieces of it because we happen to be focused on a particular cross-section or layer of the cell. So this is called the endoplasmic reticulum, which is Greek for the long, windy thing in the cell. And it, too, is a membrane. It's another role that the membrane plays. We'll label it afterwards. But it's important to remember that we're only drawing representations of it, and it does exist all through the cell, but it would complicate our picture if we just drew it all over the place, right? We have no room for other things. Now, also floating around in here, let's take some purple, and let's draw some little sort of sausagey shapes like this. Actually, let me do that with a thinner pen. so I can show you some structure as well. Little sausage shapes, like this. We'll draw, I don't know, 3 or 4. It doesn't matter. Typically, cells might have many of these. So remember, this is just a representation of some of the things we find in cells. And these things inside have a windy membrane like that, so a wiggly membrane inside. So these things are actually a double membrane. There's a membrane that forms the outer shell of them, and then they have an inner membrane that wiggles all around inside. These are called mitochondria. And these are the things that actually can take the glucose sugar that we eat, and they can take the oxygen that we breathe, and they can make that special reaction happen where we extract the energy and turn it into carbon dioxide and water. So we sometimes call them the powerhouse of the cell because they're the ones that are giving the cell its energy. We'll label them after. Mitochondria. Then we have, let's see, let's take our black again. I'm going to use the same color because this organelle, that's what these are called, by the way. All these things are called organelles. I'm going to write it here, but I'm going to have to erase that later. Just like in your body, you have organs, liver, spleen, and kidney. Well, these are not organs because organs, of course, are very large structures that are made of many cells. These are little sort of machinery parts inside a single cell. So we call them organelles, which kind of means like little tiny organs, but they're not the same thing at all. So that's what they're called, organelles. So I'm going to erase that now so I have room to draw and to label after. Okay, so another one that we can draw with the same black color is just a sort of a little circular shaped thing like this. Maybe one over here and one over here. And these are actually made of the very same membrane that is around the outside of the cell. And we'll explain all that later too. Okay. These have various purposes, and so they have various names depending on what job they do. We'll get to that when we label them. All right. I also want to take sort of I'll take the red color again. I'm going to go inside the nucleus, and I'm going to make a little squiggly mark like that. What this is it's a sort of another little organelle, and it's sort of the little nucleus, or the little thing inside the nucleus. Its name is the nucleolus. We'll label it after. But it has a role to play in terms of genes and the making of proteins and all kinds of things too. So we'll draw that in the picture. Let's see. We can also use our membrane here, and we can draw, I'll take little fine line. Cells sometimes have little tiny extensions that look like little hairs all around here sticking out. So we can draw this all around the outside. Little hairs. And these little hairs can serve a couple of different purposes. They're kind of like, you could consider them as being a bunch of little oars. Like in a rowboat, you have the oars, and you move the oars to move the boat through the water. These little guys can wiggle and shift and push on the water the cell is floating in, and they can make the cell move. And they can wiggle in all different patterns, so they're wavy little things, and they're called cilia. We'll get to that in a minute. Also, there are some longer structures that sometimes stick out of cells, not all of them, but they sort of have a little sort of special chunky part of the membrane that has some extra molecules in it, and then sticking out of that is this long sort of tail like this. And these long whip-like tails, you could think of a sperm cell as a good example, right? These tails form long sort of whips that can also move the cell and make it swim through the water. They can rotate and spin. I'll only draw 2. Sometimes a cell has 1, sometimes it has many. Maybe it might have 6 or 8 or 10, depending on what kind of cell it is. So there's those things that we want to put in the picture. All right, let's see. What else can we add to our picture? I think we should add, let's do in purple, or maybe, no, I want to avoid green. I'm running out of colors. Let me see what I can find here. Maybe this nice orange color. Let's do that. So now, let's take the orange, and let's draw, right on the end here, a little sort of pancake stack. So these are actually extensions of this blue membrane. Little pancake stack like that. Like that. And then, another thing we can draw after we've finished that, let me take another color. Let's see what other colors I might have here. How about this sort of darky blue color? Let's take that. And along this little membrane, we're going to put these little dots on this blue membrane. But be careful, don't do it all the way to the end. Just go that far. These dots are usually found very close to the nucleus because they're related to, or the job they do is related to what's going on in the nucleus. These little guys are the things that make protein molecules. They build and assemble proteins, and they do it by taking instructions from the molecules in your genes, the DNA in the nucleus. So we typically find them very close to the nucleus. Okay? But that doesn't mean they don't exist elsewhere. So I'm going to put a couple of them around here. They also exist throughout the cell, but most of them exist inside or along this membrane. Okay, another thing we can add, let's see, maybe let's see what color here, maybe this weird blue color, this pale blue color, are a little pair of a pair of structures, sorry, that kind of look like two little crossed squares. They kind of go across each other and they link together, and they float around in the animal cell. They have a role to play when it's time for the cell to grow and divide and turn into a new cell. Okay. Let's put some labels on. So, we'll start with the center part. Okay. We'll draw a red line out here from the center. And this, of course, is the nucleus of the cell. Nucleus, not nucleus. Don't spell it like nucleus. That's not really a word. Nucleus. And it's the center of the cell. And again, it is sort of where all of your genes are held, all your instructions. So it's protected in the center because it's very important. And then right beside it is this little ball, which I can draw up here like this. It's got the same sort of name, nucleolus. Nucleolus. It is found inside the nucleus, and it's sort of a little concentration of material, and we'll talk about what it does shortly. Let's take the purple guys, the little purple fellas. Let me draw a line up here, and I'll write the word for them. This is called a mitochondrion. They have a funny way of pluralizing. If you have several of them, we call them mitochondria. 6 mitochondria, or if there's only one, you call it a mitochondrion. That means a singular. And that is the special organelle that runs the cell's power. It basically extracts energy from the glucose that you eat. Mitochondrion. There's lots of them throughout the cell. The little black sort of furry things around the outside are called cilia. So we could put a little bracket thing here. These little guys here, they're called cilia. Cilia. Little short, we call them hair-like structures, but they're not hair. They're not made of the same thing that your hair is. They just remind us of hair, but they're not made of the same thing at all. And then this other thing here, this big one, is called a flagellum. Okay, again, when you pluralize in the Latin language, if you had more than one, you would call them flagella. But one is called a flagellum. In fact, you can see cilia. If you wanted to point to one of them, you'd call it a cilium. So usually means single, and a usually means more than one in the Latin language that we use to describe. Now, the blue one. It's a big name. So I'm going to draw a line to it. I'll draw the line from here. It's called the endoplasmic reticulum. Reticulum just means long and windy. Like a reticulated python is a kind of snake that can twist and turn and wrap around its prey. So endoplasmic just means sort of inside the cell. So really, this just is the long, windy thing inside the cell. But that's its fancy name, and it has a very important roles to play as well. Then we have that dark blue color, and the little dot that's on top of it, right? So I guess I could draw the line right to the dot there, down here, right to the dot. And I'll also draw the line sort of branching off to the other dot right over here, because those are the same thing. Those are called a ribosome or ribosomes. Ribosome. Okay. One more is that orangey-looking pancake stack. So the orangey-looking pancake thing is right here. Let's draw a line down here. This is called the Golgi apparatus. Sometimes it's called the Golgi body. When I was a young kid, that's what we called them, the Golgi bodies. But it's just a body or apparatus is just a word that means structure. It's a thing. And it's called Golgi because the man who discovered them, his name was Golgi, his last name. So they named it after him. Golgi apparatus. Then we have that little sort of blue crisscrossy thing, which is down here. So I'll draw a line from it way over here. And that's called the centrioles. There's two of them. Sort of, they hang out together until it's time for the cell to divide, and then they sort of centrioles. Then they sort of split up, and they go to each end of the cell, and we'll see later what that does. Centrioles. Okay. Now, all the black guys that are left, there's only two, I think, so far. So the black little things I've drawn, they have many different names, depending on the role that they play. Sometimes they just contain a blob of water. So they might be called a vacuole. A vacuole is basically a word that means a little bubble of something inside the cell. Some vacuoles, though, actually are formed at the edge of the membrane. When the cell wants to eat something, the membrane sort of wraps around it and grabs it and then folds in on itself to form a vacuole. Okay? In fact, if I wanted to, I could show you a vacuole forming. If you imagine this part of the membrane right here, just kind of folding in on itself like this. And maybe there's a little piece of some debris in here that was something the cell could ingest or use, something it could break down and use. That's a forming vacuole. So you see how what happens is this little part right here, it just pinches off, and then the vacuole breaks free, and it just floats around inside the cell. So we'll get rid of that arrow, but that's kind of what's happening there. And so the vacuole could be for ingesting food. Some vacuoles contain special molecules that the cell uses to protect itself. For instance, there are things like peroxide. You know what you put on your cuts, hydrogen peroxide? Well, it kills cells. So what cells do is they have to break it down very quickly. One of the equations we practiced with was hydrogen peroxide breaking down into water and oxygen, gas. And so you need a molecule to help that happen, a catalyst molecule called an enzyme. And so maybe you'll have a little bubble that has a bunch of those chemicals waiting to sort of be ready in case the cell encounters some peroxide. And that's called then a peroxisome, because it's a little bubble that has peroxide enzymes in it. It might be breaking food down or digesting, like these little particles of green here. I'm going to draw here, and I'm going to write a forming lysosome. Lyso means to break apart. So any kind of bubble that's job is to break things down can be called a lysosome or vacuole. Here's another lysosome, let's say down here. This one might be a lysosome. It's already formed, and it looks like if there's nothing in it, it's already digested whatever was in there, and it spread those molecules out throughout the cell. So here's another lysosome, just kind of to show you how they form. Lysosome. All right, and these are all the structures of the typical animal cell. Of course, now what we have to do is we have to sort of go through and talk about what each one does and the role that they play. Now again, animal cells don't all look like this. They look very different because there's modifications we can make and changes to the picture depending on what job the cell has to do. All right? So we'll stop this video here because we're almost out of time, and we'll do a second video. We'll just pick it up from this spot, and we'll go through and look at all the different things that are done, okay? Or all the different things and what they do.